All right, let's get into one of the most unbelievable survival stories in the history of aviation. It's a story that starts with one single tiny part on the ground and ends with a 200-ton jet making an impossible life-or-death gamble thousands of feet above the cold, dark Atlantic Ocean.
So, picture this. It's August 24th, 2001. Air Transat Flight 236 is hours into its overnight trip from Toronto to Lisbon. Most of the passengers are asleep. But then, way out over the pitch-black ocean, the unthinkable happens. That steady, reassuring hum of the engines, it just vanishes, replaced by a sudden, terrifying silence. And in that one moment, this massive jet with 306 souls on board isn't an airplane anymore. It's a glider.
That was the question, the impossible question, staring down the pilots. You've got zero engine power, no runway anywhere in sight, and just miles and miles of dark water below you. How did they even get here? Well, to figure that out, we actually have to rewind the clock 9 days, before this plane ever even left the ground.
Now, here's the thing about major disasters like this. They almost never happen because of one single mistake. It's usually a whole chain of small, seemingly unrelated things that just happen to line up in the absolute worst way possible. And for Flight 236, that first link in the chain was forged during some pretty routine maintenance.
So mechanics found these little metal shavings in the right engine's oil system. That is a serious red flag. The whole engine had to be replaced. Air Transat didn't just have a spare one lying around, so they got a loaner from the manufacturer, Rolls-Royce. But here's the kicker. The clock was ticking. They were under a ton of pressure to get that plane back in the air for its next scheduled flight.
And this is where the first critical mistake happens. See, the loaner engine, it was a slightly older model. Think of it like this. You ever tried to use an old phone charger with a new phone? It looks almost right. It might even feel like it fits, but the connections inside are just a little bit different. Well, on this engine, that tiny difference meant a fuel line and a hydraulic line were now running dangerously close together. We're talking just millimeters apart. A tiny, critical detail that went completely unnoticed.
So as they're installing this engine, a mechanic hits a wall. A fuel tube is blocking the hydraulic pump. He does the right thing, tries to look up the official procedure in the Rolls-Royce manual online, but get this, the computer network was down. The unbelievable part? The entire manual was right there in the building, on a set of CDs, but he had no idea they existed. So with time running out, he made a judgment call. He improvised, mixing and matching parts from the old and new engines just to make them fit.
If he had been able to get into that manual, this is the one sentence he would have read, this one critical instruction. Because those two mismatched tubes he just installed, they were now vibrating against each other, flight after flight, slowly but surely grinding away at the wall of the fuel line. A time bomb was officially ticking.
Okay, so let's jump back to the flight. For hours, everything seems totally fine. But down there, under the wing, that tiny crack from the vibrating tubes had finally broken open. Fuel was now gushing out of the right engine, a massive, invisible plume streaming into the night sky over the Atlantic.
At 5:33 a.m., the first alarm bell goes off in the cockpit. The computer screen flashes a huge fuel imbalance. The right tank was draining at an impossible rate. But a catastrophic fuel leak is so rare that the pilots just assumed it had to be a sensor malfunction, a computer glitch. The reality of it just seemed too wild to be true.
And here it is, the second critical link in this whole disaster chain. To fix what they thought was a simple computer error, the pilots started the standard procedure. But they did it from memory instead of pulling out the physical, printed checklist. This just perfectly shows the danger of relying on memory, even for seasoned pros. Because if they had just read the checklist, their eyes would have landed on this one crucial note, a little prompt to consider the very thing they thought was impossible, a massive fuel leak. It would have sent them down a completely different and life-saving path.
So here's the bottom line. By following that imbalance procedure from memory, they opened something called a crossfeed valve. The goal was to send fuel from the full left tank over to the right to balance the plane out. But they weren't balancing anything. They were pumping every last drop of their good fuel directly into the leak. They were literally feeding the fire. At 6:13 in the morning, the right engine, now totally starved of fuel, just flamed out. Gone. Only 13 minutes later, at 6:26 a.m., the left engine sputtered and died. And just like that, the plane was a massive, powerless glider falling through the sky. And they were still 144 kilometers, that's almost 90 miles, from the nearest runway, a small military base in the Azores Islands. No commercial jetliner in history had ever even come close to gliding that far. It was, by all accounts, completely impossible.
As the main generators died, this little propeller called the ram air turbine, or RAT for short, automatically dropped down from the belly of the plane. The air rushing past spun the turbine, and it generated just enough electricity to power the most basic flight controls and a few key instruments. It was their only lifeline.
Inside the cabin, it was pure terror. That constant drone of the engines was replaced by this eerie silence so profound, people said their ears were ringing. Then the lights went out, plunging everyone into total darkness. The flight attendants, staying unbelievably calm, told passengers to put on their life vest for a possible ditching in the ocean, which, as you can imagine, caused a lot of confusion and panic. People were praying, they were scribbling notes to their families, they were preparing for the end.
For 19 long, silent minutes, Captain Robert Pichet and First Officer Dirk de Jager did the impossible. They just masterfully nursed that aircraft, managing its speed and descent to stretch the glide as far as it could possibly go. And then, a glimmer of hope. Through the darkness, they saw the runway lights. They had one shot at this. There were no second chances, no go-arounds.
At 6:45 a.m., the plane slammed onto the runway. Without any engine power for reverse thrust, they had to rely completely on the emergency brakes. 8 of the 10 main tires just blew out in a shower of sparks and smoke. But against all odds, the plane stayed on the runway and screeched to a halt. They had made it.
The result was, well, it was nothing short of a miracle. In less than 2 minutes, every single one of the 306 people on board was evacuated. There were 0 fatalities, just a handful of injuries, and most of those were minor, from sliding down the emergency slides. Everyone survived.
Captain Pichet was celebrated all over the world as a hero, and rightfully so. But pretty soon after, a shocking detail from his past came out. 2 decades earlier, he'd actually served prison time for smuggling drugs. The news created a media frenzy, of course, questioning the character of this newfound hero. But for the 306 people whose lives he saved, it didn't change a thing. So when you look at the whole picture, this wasn't just one failure. It was a cascade. A maintenance shortcut taken under pressure, a manual that was never read, a checklist that was never consulted. There was even a recommended fuel leak detection system that had never been installed on the plane. Each one was like a hole in the layers of safety, and on this one flight, they all just happened to line up perfectly. You know, the story of Flight 236 is an incredible testament to human skill under pressure. But it's also this powerful reminder that our complex world often balances on the simplest of checks. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What are the unseen checklists and tiny, crucial details that keep our own lives from falling apart every single day?